moment Captain Caldric Hawthorne's boot connected with Moniva Dareth's shin, the entire cabin fell into a silence so absolute you could hear the hum of the aircraft engines like thunder. Could anyone on this flight have had the courage to act in that moment? Or would they, like so many before them, have stayed silent, turning away from injustice because confronting it felt too dangerous, too uncomfortable, too risky to their own peace? Moniva didn't flinch. She simply looked down at her leg, then slowly raised her eyes to meet the captain's smug gaze, her expression as still as a pond before a storm. The other passengers held their breath, waiting for tears, for screaming, for something that would match the shock rippling through the cabin. But Moniva only adjusted her headscarf with deliberate grace, folded her hands in her lap, and returned her gaze to the window beside her seat in 14B. Captain Hawthorne smirked, straightening his uniform cap as he turned away, confident in his authority and utterly oblivious to the miscalculation he'd just made. 20 minutes earlier, Moniva had settled into Flight 2847 from Atlanta to Los Angeles without incident. At 42, she carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark skin glowing with health, her natural hair wrapped elegantly in a bronze and amber headscarf, her warm brown eyes reflecting years of discipline and hard-won wisdom. She was traveling to a conference where she'd demonstrate advanced self-defense techniques to law enforcement trainers, though no one on this flight knew that yet. That's when Captain Caldric Hawthorne first emerged from the cockpit. He was tall, steel-gray hair perfectly coiffed, his uniform impeccable, his posture military straight. But there was nothing warm about his presence as his cold eyes swept over the passengers like a lord surveying his subjects. Moniva noticed immediately how his gaze lingered on certain passengers, particularly women of color. When his eyes landed on her, something shifted in his expression. "Everything satisfactory back here?" he asked the cabin at large, though his gaze remained fixed on Moniva. She remained silent, her eyes on her book about martial arts philosophy. She'd learned long ago that some provocations were best met with calm indifference. "Miss," Hawthorne said sharply, "I asked if everything was satisfactory." Moniva looked up slowly. "Yes, Captain. Everything is fine. Thank you for asking." "Are you sure?" He stepped closer. "You seem distracted. Not concerned about the flight, are you?" "I'm perfectly comfortable with flying, Captain," she replied evenly. "I fly frequently." "And what's your purpose in Los Angeles?" His tone suggested he didn't believe whatever she might say. "I'm attending a professional conference." "What kind of conference?" Moniva paused. Something told her that revealing she was a martial arts instructor who trained law enforcement would escalate his condescension. "A training conference," she said simply. "Training for what?" "Self-improvement," Moniva replied, her voice carrying a hint of steel now. "Personal development. The kind of thing we could all benefit from." A passenger too rose back. A middle-aged man named Vayon snorted softly at that, earning him a sharp look from Hawthorne. The captain's jaw tightened. "I see," he said coldly. "Well, I trust you'll follow all crew instructions during the flight. Some passengers require more supervision than others." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Moniva breathed deeply, centering herself the way her first sensei had taught her 30 years ago. "I'm confident the crew will find me a model passenger," she said quietly. Hawthorne held her gaze a moment longer, then turned sharply and strode back toward the cockpit. Several passengers exchanged looks of discomfort. "Are you okay?" whispered the woman in 14A, a young professional named Solara. Moniva smiled reassuringly. "I'm fine. Thank you." But she knew this was only the beginning. The flight took off smoothly, Atlanta falling away beneath them as they climbed into clear skies. About an hour into the flight, Junera, a kind-eyed flight attendant, brought the beverage cart through. When she reached Moniva's row, she leaned in slightly. "I'm sorry about earlier," she whispered. "He can be difficult." The careful word choice told Moniva everything. This wasn't an isolated incident. Hawthorne had a pattern. "It's not your fault," Moniva assured her. "Thank you for your kindness." She wondered silently how many others had suffered similar treatment from Hawthorne. How many had simply endured his arrogance and disrespect because challenging a captain mid-flight felt impossible, futile. That's when Hawthorne emerged from the cockpit again. He walked into the cabin with that same proprietary air, scanning passengers as if conducting an inspection. Caldric, the senior flight attendant, looked up from the galley with carefully neutral wariness. "Just checking on our passengers," Hawthorne said smoothly, "making sure everyone's following regulations." He began walking down the aisle, making small comments to various passengers, complimenting some, nodding approvingly at others. Then he reached row 14. "Still reading?" he asked Moniva, his voice carrying a mocking edge. She looked up calmly. "Yes, Captain. Must be quite a book." He leaned over slightly. "What is it?" "Romance novel." The condescension was so blatant that Solara gasped softly. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. "It's a book on philosophy," Moniva replied evenly. "Specifically, the philosophy of discipline and restraint." "Restraint," Hawthorne repeated mockingly. "Interesting choice. Tell me, do you always need to be reminded to restrain yourself?" The implication was vile. Vayon across the aisle pulled off his headphones, his expression darkening. A woman 2 rows back, Caliph, leaned forward, as if preparing to intervene. Moniva closed her book carefully. She looked up at Hawthorne with eyes that betrayed nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She was measuring him now, his stance, his center of gravity, the tension in his shoulders. Professional assessment, automatic as breathing. "Captain Hawthorne," she said clearly, "I'm not sure what I've done to attract your particular attention, but I assure you I'm following all regulations and causing no disruption. Perhaps you might focus your energies on flying the aircraft." Hawthorne's face flushed red. "You don't tell me how to do my job," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I am the captain of this aircraft. I have absolute authority here. Do you understand that?" "I understand your role," Moniva replied calmly. "I'm simply requesting that you allow me to complete my flight in peace." "In peace," Hawthorne repeated mockingly. He glanced around at the watching passengers. "You people always play the victim, don't you? Always claiming discrimination. Always demanding special treatment." "Captain," Caldric's voice cut through from the front of the cabin. "Sir, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Stay out of this, Caldric," Hawthorne snapped. "I'm addressing a passenger concern." "I haven't expressed any concern," Moniva said quietly, "except for the concern that I be allowed to read my book without harassment." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your seat belt is fastened too loosely," he said suddenly. "That's a safety violation. Tighten it. Now." Moniva glanced down. Her seat belt was perfectly adequate. This was a power play, pure and simple. "My seat belt is properly fastened, Captain," she said. "I said tighten it." His voice rang through the cabin. A child somewhere behind them started crying. Junera appeared from the galley, her expression distressed. Moniva took a deep breath. She could resist, but she recognized this dynamic. Sometimes de-escalation meant giving ground on small things to avoid larger confrontations. She reached down and pulled the seat belt tighter. "Satisfied?" she asked. "No." Hawthorne's response was immediate and vindictive. "Now it's too tight. You clearly don't know how to follow simple instructions. Maybe you shouldn't be traveling alone if you can't manage basic safety procedures." The gasps from nearby passengers were audible now. This had crossed into something much darker. Targeted personal harassment with racial and possibly religious overtones. Moniva felt her training kick in fully. Her sensei's voice echoed. "When facing an opponent who has lost control, your control becomes your greatest weapon." "Captain Hawthorne," she said quietly, "I would like to speak with the senior flight attendant about this interaction." "You'll speak to who I tell you to speak to," Hawthorne shot back. He turned to Caldric. "This passenger is being disruptive. I want a formal complaint filed." Caldric's expression was pained. "Sir, with respect, I haven't observed any disruptive behavior. Are you questioning my judgment?" Hawthorne rounded on him. Because I can have you replaced at the next stop. The cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger was watching now, some with phones in hand. Moniva sat perfectly still. She could escalate this, could demand her rights, could threaten legal action. But experience had taught her that sometimes the high road meant enduring injustice in the moment to expose it more fully later. If only someone had the courage to stand up when it mattered most. She thought, how different these situations might unfold. I apologize if I've given any appearance of disruption, she said carefully. I simply wish to complete my flight quietly. Hawthorne studied her, perhaps surprised by her continued composure. Then his expression shifted into something crueler. Stand up, he ordered. Moniva blinked. Excuse me? I said stand up. I need to verify you're not concealing anything in your seat. Captain? Junera interjected, her voice shaking. That's not standard procedure. I'll determine what's standard on my aircraft. Hawthorne cut her off. The request was absurd, obviously pretextual. But Moniva could see the trap. She stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Several passengers leaned into the aisle to watch. Turn around, Hawthorne commanded. Moniva turned, facing the window. She could feel his eyes on her, feel the violation of his scrutiny. Satisfied? She asked, her back still to him. That's when he kicked her. It wasn't a tap or accidental contact. It was a deliberate kick to the back of her shin, hard enough to hurt, clearly intended to make her stumble. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. Moniva absorbed the impact, her years of training allowing her to maintain her balance without effort. She turned slowly to face Hawthorne, and in that moment, every person in the cabin could see the mask of composure she wore, not realizing what was beneath it. Not fear, not submission, but the coiled readiness of a master waiting for the right moment. You kicked me, she said quietly. I bumped you, Hawthorne corrected dismissively. Maybe if you'd followed instructions properly, you wouldn't have been in the way. Sit down before you cause any more problems. The gaslighting was immediate and shameless. Several passengers started to protest. Vayon half rose from his seat. Calith said, That's not what we saw. And a business traveler named Arinder near the back called out, Captain, that was completely inappropriate. Unless you all want to be on a no-fly list, I suggest you mind your own business, Hawthorne said coldly. Moniva sat, her shin throbbing but her expression unchanged. She wondered silently how many others suffered like this every day. Not just on airplanes but everywhere, enduring cruelty from people drunk on their own authority while the world looked away, choosing comfort over the discomfort of confronting injustice. How easily we all become complicit, she thought, when speaking up feels too costly. She met Hawthorne's eyes, and for just a moment, she let him see something beneath her calm exterior. Not fear, but assessment. The kind of look a warrior gives when measuring an opponent. Hawthorne broke eye contact first, turning away with a dismissive snort. The show's over. He strode back toward the cockpit. The cabin erupted in whispered conversations. Several passengers reached for their phones. Caldric knelt beside Moniva's seat. Ma'am, he said quietly, I am so sorry. That was completely unacceptable. I'll be filing a report as soon as we land. Are you hurt? I'm fine, Moniva assured him. Thank you for your concern. I want you to know, Caldric continued. This will be documented. What he did, that's assault. We have cameras in the cabin. Everything's recorded. This information settled into Moniva's mind with significance. Video evidence. Multiple witnesses. A pattern of behavior. Thank you, Caldric, she said. I appreciate your support. Junera brought an ice pack, her eyes shining with tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered. You didn't deserve that. It's not your fault, Moniva told her. And please don't worry about me. I'm more resilient than I might appear. If Junera had known Moniva's background, 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo, 3rd degree in Jiu-Jitsu, certified instructor in Krav Maga, former military close combat trainer, current consultant for law enforcement, she might have been less worried. But Moniva had learned long ago that revealing her capabilities too early often escalated situations unnecessarily. She applied the ice pack and returned to her book, though she wasn't really reading. She was thinking, planning, waiting. Hawthorne thought he'd won. He was wrong on every count. The next 2 hours passed with uncomfortable tension hanging over the cabin. Passengers kept glancing at Moniva with sympathy, curiosity, anger on her behalf. So Lara whispered that she'd recorded everything on her phone and uploaded it to the cloud. "Are you going to sue?" So Lara asked. "Because you totally should. That was assault." "I'm going to handle it appropriately," Moniva said calmly. "The system will work if we let it." As they began their descent into Los Angeles, Moniva felt her mind entering the calm, focused state she'd cultivated through decades of martial arts practice. She wasn't planning violence, but she was preparing for confrontation, for the moment when patience transformed into action. The landing was smooth. As they taxied to the gate, Hawthorne's voice came over the intercom, utterly normal, as if nothing unusual had happened. The casual disregard was almost as offensive as the assault itself. The seat belt sign dinged off. Passengers began deplaning. Caldric appeared at Moniva's row. "Ma'am, would you please wait? Airport security and airline management will want to speak with you. I've already contacted them." "Of course," Moniva agreed. Several passengers paused to offer support as they passed. Each promised they'd seen what happened. Each said they'd provide statements. The solidarity was touching and would be important. As the cabin emptied, Junera brought water and snacks. "It might be a while," she said. "I have time," Moniva assured her. "And patience." Then the cockpit door opened, and Captain Caldric Hawthorne emerged. He looked surprised to see Moniva still seated. His expression quickly shifted to annoyance. "Why are you still here?" he demanded. "Flight's over. Time to go." "I'm waiting to speak with airport security and airline management," Moniva replied calmly. "Regarding the incident during the flight." Hawthorne's face darkened. "Incident? What incident?" "The one where you kicked me," Moniva said clearly, "in front of approximately 140 witnesses." "I did no such thing," Hawthorne said immediately. "You're confused, or lying, or trying to stir up trouble, probably looking for a lawsuit payout." The gaslighting was predictable. Moniva simply watched him, letting him dig his hole deeper. "I bumped you accidentally," Hawthorne continued indignantly. "This is exactly the kind of entitled behavior I've come to expect from." He stopped himself, but the implication hung in the air. "From people like you." "Captain Hawthorne." Caldric's voice was firm. "Sir, I need to inform you that I filed a formal incident report. Multiple passengers have also expressed interest in providing statements." Hawthorne whirled on him. "You did what?" "My job," Caldric replied steadily. "Sir, what occurred during this flight was unacceptable. I have a duty to report it." "You're suspended," Hawthorne snapped. "Effective immediately." "You don't have that authority," Caldric interrupted, his voice carrying steel. "And threatening retaliation for a safety report is itself a violation of federal aviation regulations." "Sir." Moniva could see Hawthorne processing this, realizing his authority wasn't as absolute as he'd believed. "This is ridiculous," Hawthorne said, but there was a tremor in his voice now. "All of this over a simple misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Moniva said, standing. As she rose, ready to finally confront the man who'd abused his power so casually, it made everyone in that moment realize how many times we choose comfort over justice in our own lives. How many voices remain unheard because we stay silent when it matters most. How many injustices go unchallenged because speaking up feels too risky. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who commanded space through presence rather than size. "You harassed me from the moment you first saw me. You singled me out without cause, questioned my right to be on this flight, made inappropriate comments, and then you kicked me. These are facts. They're documented. They're witnessed. And they will have consequences." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the quiet strength, made Hawthorne take a step back. For the first time, he seemed to really see her. "Who are you?" he asked involuntarily. Someone who knows the law, Moniva replied. Someone who understands my rights. Someone who will hold you accountable. But most importantly, she paused. Someone you never should have touched. The jetway door opened. 2 airport security officers and a woman in an airline manager's uniform entered, along with a man in a suit legal counsel. Captain Hawthorne, the airline manager said crisply. I'm District Manager Serena Walsh. You're to come with me immediately. There's been a serious allegation requiring investigation. Allegation? Hawthorne sputtered. This is absurd. Sir, one security officer interrupted. We have multiple passenger statements, flight crew statements, and cabin camera footage. The investigation is mandatory. Please come with us. Hawthorne's face went through several color changes. He looked at Moniva, perhaps realizing for the first time that this wasn't going away. I want my union representative, he said. That's your right, Walsh agreed. They've been contacted, but you need to come now. As the officers flanked Hawthorne, he looked at Moniva one more time. This is a mistake, he said. You're going to regret making a big deal out of nothing. Moniva tilted her head slightly. Captain Hawthorne, she said quietly, the only mistake was yours, and the only regret will be yours as well. They led him away. As the door closed, Moniva felt some tension leave her shoulders. It wasn't over, but the immediate confrontation had passed. Ms. Dareth, Walsh had remained behind. I need to apologize on behalf of the airline for what you experienced. What Captain Hawthorne did was completely unacceptable. Thank you, Moniva acknowledged. I need to ask if you require medical attention. That won't be necessary, Moniva interrupted gently. The injury is minor, but I will need copies of all relevant documentation, including the cabin camera footage, flight attendant reports, and any previous complaints filed against Captain Hawthorne. Walsh's expression became guarded. Some of that information may be protected by privacy policies that don't apply when assault has occurred, Moniva finished. I'm well versed in aviation law, Ms. Walsh. I regularly train TSA and law enforcement personnel in de-escalation and defensive tactics. I understand exactly what documentation I'm entitled to and why. The revelation shifted something in Walsh's demeanor. Moniva wasn't some random passenger who could be mollified with vouchers. She was someone who understood the system, knew her rights, had the expertise to pursue this effectively. Of course, Walsh said carefully. We'll make sure you receive everything you're entitled to. I'd like to give my statement now, Moniva said, while events are fresh. And I'd like to do so in the presence of airport police, not just airline security, so there's an independent record. Walsh nodded. That can be arranged. As Moniva prepared to leave the aircraft, Junera appeared one more time, her eyes red but determined. I've been flying for 6 years, Junera said, her voice thick with emotion. And I've seen Captain Hawthorne treat people the way he treated you at least a dozen times. Never this extreme, never physical, but always finding someone to pick on. There's always women, always people of color. And every time someone complained, nothing happened. He's got seniority, connections, union protection. She took a shaky breath. But maybe this time will be different. Because of you. Because you stood up to him. Moniva squeezed the younger woman's hand. It will be different this time, she said with quiet certainty. Because we have evidence. Because we have witnesses. Because you and Thalric were brave enough to file reports despite his threats. Change happens when enough people refuse to accept the unacceptable. The next 3 hours were a blur of statement giving and documentation. Airport police took her statement with careful attention, photographing the bruise on her shin, collecting witness contact information, securing cabin footage that clearly showed Hawthorne's harassment and the kick. So Lara had waited and provided her statement, including her phone video. Vayon, Calith, Irinder, and more than 20 other passengers voluntarily gave statements as well, each corroborating Moniva's account. When Moniva reviewed the cabin footage, she saw what others had seen. A captain abusing authority and committing assault. But she also saw her own restraint, her composure, her perfect control. That control proved she hadn't escalated, hadn't provoked, hadn't done anything except exist as a target for Hawthorne's prejudice. By the time she was cleared to leave, evening had fallen over Los Angeles. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sensei, Master Lu. Heard about your flight. Are you all right? Moniva typed back, I'm fine. Handled with patience and will follow up with persistence. Lessons learned well. The response came quickly. Proud of you. Remember, justice isn't always immediate, but it is inevitable when pursued with wisdom. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation exploded. Solar's video, combined with passenger statements and cabin footage, was reviewed by the airline's legal department, the FAA, the district attorney's office, and multiple news outlets. Hawthorne was immediately suspended, but as details emerged about his history, a pattern of complaints, multiple previous incidents, allegations of discriminatory behavior that had been buried, the investigation expanded exponentially. The breakthrough came when 2 former flight attendants, encouraged by coverage of Moniva's case, came forward with their own stories of harassment by Hawthorne. Both had filed complaints years earlier that had been dismissed as misunderstandings. The pattern was undeniable. Hawthorne had spent years abusing his authority, confident his position protected him. He'd been enabled by a system that protected rank over people. But not this time. 3 weeks after the flight, Walsh called Moniva. Ms. Dareth, I'm calling to inform you that the airline has completed its investigation. Captain Hawthorne has been terminated effective immediately. His pilot certification is under review by the FAA, and criminal assault charges have been filed by the district attorney's office. Moniva absorbed this calmly. I appreciate you keeping me informed. There's more, Walsh continued. We discovered significant gaps in our procedures for handling complaints against senior personnel. We're implementing comprehensive policy changes and mandatory training on discrimination, abuse of authority, and passenger rights for all cockpit crew. That's a positive step, Moniva acknowledged. Additionally, Walsh said, the airline would like to offer you a formal apology and compensation. We'd also like to discuss your potential involvement in developing and delivering some of the training programs we're implementing. Your background makes you uniquely qualified to help us do better. Moniva had never sought publicity or compensation, only accountability and change. But the opportunity to shape systemic improvements, to help ensure others didn't experience what she had, was compelling. I'd be interested in discussing that, she said. Send me the details. The final chapter came a month later in a downtown Los Angeles courthouse. The criminal assault case against Hawthorne was scheduled for a preliminary hearing. Moniva attended, along with several passenger witnesses, Thalric, Junera, and the 2 former flight attendants. Hawthorne arrived with his attorneys, looking diminished. His uniform replaced by a cheap suit, his arrogance replaced by a hunted look. When he saw Moniva, his expression crumbled. During a recess, Hawthorne approached her, his attorneys trying to intercept but arriving too late. Ms. Dareth, he said, his voice hoarse. I want to. He struggled for words. Moniva waited, giving him space. I'm sorry, he finally said. For everything. The way I treated you, the things I said, the kick. All of it. I was wrong. I've been wrong for a long time, and I just kept telling myself I had authority, that people needed to respect. He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm making excuses. There are no excuses. I'm sorry. Moniva studied him. The apology sounded genuine, or as genuine as it could be from someone forced to confront his behavior through consequences. There was something real in his eyes, shame, perhaps, or the beginning of actual understanding. Captain Hawthorne, she said quietly, I appreciate the apology, but you should know, I didn't pursue this for revenge. I pursued it so you couldn't do to someone else what you did to me. That's why consequences matter. That's why accountability matters. Hawthorne nodded slowly. I understand, and for what it's worth, I'm glad someone finally stopped me. I just wish it hadn't taken all this to make me see it. His attorneys pulled him away. Moniva felt something release in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a sense of completion. The preliminary hearing established sufficient cause for the case to proceed. Hawthorne's attorneys negotiated a plea deal: guilty to assault, mandatory counseling, community service, permanent revocation of his pilot's license, and a formal public apology. He would avoid jail time but would carry a criminal record and never fly professionally again. On the day of the plea hearing, Hawthorne stood before the judge and read his prepared apology. "I abused my position of authority," he read, his voice shaking. "I allowed prejudice and arrogance to guide my actions. I caused harm to people who trusted that the system would protect them, and instead I became the thing they needed protection from. I am deeply sorry, and I accept full responsibility for my actions and their consequences." Moniva sat in the gallery, flanked by Solara and several other passengers who'd become friends. She listened, witnessed his sentencing, and felt the weight of justice rendered, imperfect perhaps, incomplete in some ways, but real nonetheless. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, reporters approached. Moniva had declined most interview requests, but she agreed to make a brief statement now. "What happened on that flight," she said clearly for the cameras, "happens far too often. People in positions of authority sometimes forget that their power comes with responsibility. When they abuse that authority, when they target people because of race, gender, religion, or any other factor, it's not just a personal failing. It's a violation of the trust we place in systems and institutions." She paused, making sure her next words carried weight. "I'm grateful for the accountability achieved in this case. I'm grateful to the flight crew who had the courage to report despite potential retaliation. I'm grateful to the passengers who stayed to give statements. I'm grateful to the airline for implementing meaningful policy changes. But mostly, I want people to understand that accountability is possible. Justice is possible. It requires courage, persistence, and support, but it's possible. No one is powerless against abuse of authority, no matter how absolute that authority seems." A reporter called out, "What would you say to other people who experience similar treatment?" Moniva smiled slightly. "Document everything. Find witnesses. Report through official channels. Don't let fear or resignation convince you that nothing will change. Sometimes patience isn't submission, it's strategy. And sometimes the strongest response is refusing to be silenced." The press conference ended. Her phone buzzed with a text from Master Lu. "The student has become the master. You have shown the true meaning of martial arts, not violence, but justice. Not revenge, but accountability. Not anger, but wisdom. Well done." Moniva smiled. The sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She had a conference to prepare for, training sessions to lead, a new consulting contract with the airline. Life continued, richer now for the knowledge that she'd made a difference. She thought about that moment when Hawthorne's boot had connected with her shin, when every passenger had held their breath waiting to see if she would break. She thought about how patient, how controlled, how strategic she'd been, knowing that the right response wasn't immediate but inevitable. Captain Caldric Hawthorne had thought he was teaching her a lesson about authority and her place in his hierarchy. Instead, he'd encountered someone who understood that real strength wasn't about domination. It was about discipline. Real power wasn't about violence, it was about justice. And real victories weren't won in moments of anger. They were won through patience, evidence, and the courage to demand accountability. The kick that was meant to humiliate had instead sparked change that would protect countless future passengers. Sometimes the smallest act of cruelty could become the catalyst for the largest transformation. And in the end, that was the most satisfying justice of all, knowing that Hawthorne's moment of arrogance had become the seed of his own accountability, and that her patience had proven more powerful than his authority ever was. She boarded her flight home the next day, a different airline, but she would have flown the same one without fear if needed. She settled into her seat, opened a new book on philosophy and martial ethics, and smiled when the captain made the pre-flight announcement with professionalism and respect. This was how it should be. This was how it could be. And if anyone ever tried to make it otherwise again, well, she'd be ready, patient as ever, strong as ever, and absolutely unwilling to let abuse of authority go unchallenged. The captain who kicked her had learned that lesson the hard way. She hoped no one else would need to. But if they did, she and people like her, witnesses like Solara and Vayon and Calith, crew members like Thalric and Junera, all the people who'd found their voices through this incident, would be there to ensure that justice prevailed.